Go on.
Dude, you're rocking with the Vision Pro.
Should I record the episode like this?
What do you feel free to? What are you seeing? Let's see what our guest responds to it. How are you using the Vision
Well,
Pro at the
I'm
moment?
I'm just looking at Sankey diagrams right now, and it's like total Vision Pro. You can kind of see the full the full flow of everything through a Sankey diagram.
For those who don't know, which is probably some percentage of listeners, do you want to explain the significance of the Sankey diagram, perhaps the relevance at the moment?
Well, let me come out of spatial reality and back into real reality. I don't know. It's a pretty esoteric chart that got some play over the last week or so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Someone had a birthday and yeah. We can just leave it at that. I just Sankey diagram birthday. I'm sure you can find your fill of memes. How about that?
yeah. Turpentine was lucky to be the official sponsor of the birthday. And yeah, she's very gifted at becoming the talk of the town, the sort of
The current thing, as we might call it.
capturing the zeitgeist.
Well, you know, it's funny. I actually think Ayla and Brian Johnson and there are just a few people who they know how to kind of really snap everyone's attention on Twitter.
Yeah.
And then there's like the interesting thing is there's a whole bunch of like I don't know if you call them reply guys, but it's like Growing Daniel or whatever. It's just they just like feed whatever that meme is.
Yeah. There's like a whole
they're the first level, just like absolute fire tweets, bangers that then the kind of like mids like myself then try to make the second tier jokes, but that it cascades out.
There's a meme,
and then it's like a week later, and you have some random person in your real life send you a text being like, "Did you see this tweet?" And it's like, dude, like you don't even want to know how many tweets that I saw.
Yeah, it's a meme supply chain. Growing Daniel's like the 4chan of Twitter, basically.
Yeah. Or he's a tastemaker, right? Like he can see true art happening on Twitter, and then just really put it into the meme grinder.
Yeah. Maybe we should have him on at some point.
I would love that. I mean, I think he's my favorite. I think he's the funniest account.
Yeah, great.
There are other funny accounts, but we're not allowed to talk about those accounts because, even on a podcast like this, I think they're beyond polite company.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Rudyard, doing great. For some of the audience who may be new to Rudyard is the owner of the very popular YouTube history account called What If Alt Hist, like What If Alt History, that I think has over 600,000 subscribers at this point and makes these fascinating history videos. We've started a podcast together called History 102, where Rudyard comes on and explains, World War I, the Vikings, modern China, the fall of Rome. Rudyard, just to give an intro to our audience, how would you describe yourself as a historian? Like if there are schools of thought as it relates to the different kinds of historians, or that you're like following the lineage of, or when you differentiate from other historians, how do you think of yourself?
First of all, thank you for having me. And it's been a pleasure working with Erik on season 1 of History 102. And to answer your question, I'm not a credentialed person. I'm a 22-year-old who's a college dropout. So, as I like to say, I am a person with no credentials who's betting against God that you listen to at your own expense. And the reason I say betting against God is a big part of what I do in my channel is I predict the future based off the patterns of history. And I always say that there's a million ways to be wrong and only a handful to be right. So you're betting against God. And my model of history, and for my YouTube channel, it is history, but it's also a bunch of other things, where I look at anthropology, I look at civilizations, I look at geopolitics, and the underlying work I try to do is to figure out the patterns in history and the rules that different historic societies maintain so that you can kind of understand how the human condition operates and how the world works. And there is a myth that I only read books written before 1960. That's not true. The vast majority of books I read are from the 21st century, but I do read a lot of older authors because I think the peak of history writing was around World War II, because you were able to combine the vast scope histories of 150 years ago with the anal data focus of recent histories. And something where I'm very proud of my research in is civilizations, where I look at the different world civilizations like Western, Indian, Chinese, etc., and from that, um, what their strengths and weaknesses are, how they came into being, um, what their cycles of history have been, and that sort of thing.
Cool.
So, Rudyard, this is really random. Erik said we were going to do this podcast, and I couldn't fall asleep one of these nights, and I was on my YouTube feed. Did you do a video on the Byzantine Empire?
I've done a couple. I did I did alternate history for 7 years, which is like, what if the South won the Civil War? What if the Nazis won World War II? I did a video explaining I did a video, what if the Byzantine Empire never fell? That was like 4 or 5 years ago. And
I think I watched that this week, which is really funny. At Manzikert, and then you're basically talking about, like, if they never lose to the Turks originally, what happens?
Yeah, I was a child then. It's funny to see people go back to my alternate history work, because that's what I did for the first. I've been doing YouTube for 10 years. I founded the YouTube channel on my 13th birthday. And so first 7 years doing alternate history, and then I had a career shift during COVID.
What was the career shift? First of all, I love that video, by the way. Like,
Thank you.
I think the Byzantine Empire is a woefully underappreciated
Agreed.
Period of history.
I was stuck at home during COVID, and I kind of made a calculation in high school that if I wanted to succeed, I had to succeed through being an entrepreneur, or if I followed the traditional track, it wouldn't work. And I was stuck at home during COVID during my gap year, and I thought, I'm just going to work on my channel. And I started branching out into other content, like the one that I do now. I just found it much more rewarding. And when I look at the alternate history versus what I do today, it feels like a lot of fantasy authors start out writing fan fiction of other fantasy novels. 50 Shades is the easiest example of that, where it started as Twilight fan fiction, then she became her own author. And that's how I kind of feel at alternate history, where I think alternate history informed. I'm really glad I did it, because it gave me a lot of YouTube training, and it informed how I think about the world. Where if you're constantly thinking about, if you changed blank, it's almost a scientific method of analysis to determine what the causal variables in history are.
And how would you describe what you do now?
As I said before, it's people have had trouble explaining it. Where I've had a group of friends where they're like, I've had a group of friends where they've said, is what if altist anthropology? Is it history? Is it sociology? Is it geopolitics? And I sit at the crux of all those fields. And something people like about my show is that I can pull in neuroscience, or I can pull in biology or anthropology or family structure. But the thing that I know the best is history. In a field, I know a lot about anthropology, but I think the thing that I do the most is look at the patterns in history to determine what they mean.
Dan, you're something of a self-taught, at the very least, hobby historian. Certainly before your time running Farcaster in your couple years off. Certainly the best historian in tech that I've come across, maybe except for Mark Andreessen or something, or maybe Antonio's also pretty deep in his own way. How when you trace a little bit of your journey, or what kind of sort of school of thought that you think or lineage that you think you followed?
Yeah, I would be hard pressed to say that one of the best amateur historians, but I do enjoy history, and I like esoteric history. Right, the more esoteric. And to your point about books before 1960, the older the book, and definitely nothing in the 21st century, in my view, most of the time is anything worth reading. But I think the thing that and Erik, I think we talked about this a couple of years ago when I first came on your podcast. I think I've always liked history, but I think when I finally had some time off, and I went really deep and read something like 140 books or 150 books in 18 months, which for the first time in my life, I just like literally had nothing to do. So I could just kind of follow my intellectual interests. I got really interested in the question of how does the modern world work? And fundamentally, I think a lot of that comes down to is understanding history and what are the kind of big macro trends that have driven us to where we are today. And then the more you peel back the reason for why that trend ended up happening is you start to get a deeper understanding of the kind of like big macro trends in history. And then to your point, Rudyard, I think the interdisciplinary approach makes it a lot more interesting, right? Like just to kind of only view it through the lens of like the great men of history, or, history is just a history of economics or energy or any of this kind of stuff is, I think it's too simplistic. It's a pretty dynamic system. I think actually one book that really impacted me in terms of how I think about history from not just the people side of things, but more the scientific side. A lot of people talk about like gun germs and steel, which I think is actually, gets a lot of hate. But the reality is the reason it gets a lot of hate is because it was really popular. And I think there's, a lot of interesting stuff from that book. It's Jared Diamond, for those who don't know it. But I actually think David Reich's Who We Are and How We Got Here
I've read
was a
that.
Tyler Cowen recommendation in 2018. And, Marginal Revolution. And he said at the time, he's like, this is probably one of the most important books of this year, if not this decade. And so I immediately bought it on Amazon, and then I went and read it. And I was at Coinbase, and I wasn't that busy. And it was just eye-opening to have such a, relatable, like in the sense that I was a layperson in this topic of like, kind of like wide-scale genetic analysis. But at the same time, he could bring me along on the journey of all the kind of research he had done. And I think that kind of really clicked for me going into this time that I was off and Rudyard, I'd be curious how you describe this, but I think that there's this big gaping hole in kind of like modern history writing around like a systems approach to history in terms of like, what are the main factors and how does history work as a scientific thing, rather than what I think most modern history is very political, or it starts with kind of like an agenda.
I've read that book you described. It's very good. It's a book on how we've rewritten the history of the ancient world through genetics. So I'd recommend that. Also, I'd recommend to you my video on modern civilization, where it's one of my best videos, in my opinion, where I break down what I see that there is a separate modern civilization independent from other civilizations. I talk about how that formed, but it's pretty easy, in my opinion, to say why we don't do that. It's because we don't want to know the answer. Because if you start to look at history for rules on how to run society, then you have to see if you come up short. And that's not something we really want to do. Where if you look at all of our society today, it's based upon the abdication of social standards, where we don't want to be assessed by any of them. And if you start going back through history, you'll start to see unpleasant things. And my favorite authors are a lot of my favorite authors are people who do look at those patterns, where my favorite history writer is Amaury de Riencourt, who he was a French writer of the World War II era, and he did like 5 brilliant intellectual jumps that I haven't seen anywhere else. So one thing Amaury de Riencourt did is he talked about how the relations between men and women have changed the course of history. So look at different civilizations in world history, how they gave men and women different rights, and then how that resulted in their rise and fall. Then he also wrote a book, The Civilizational Cycles, comparing Rome to America. And he said, writing in the 50s, he thought America would gradually slide into Caesarism, like the fall of the Roman Republic. And he explained Indian and Chinese civilization in the best way I've seen anywhere else. And a brilliant book he also wrote was The Eye of Shiva, which was a way of integrating Eastern mysticism with modern science. So I have tremendous respect for Amaury de Riencourt. But there's like 5 or 6 authors of that time period who were trying to develop a method to create a science of history. And then starting with the baby boomers, that was all shoved in the trash can, basically.
And why do you think it was just political, or what stopped that kind of progression?
Yeah. I think First of all, as a society, we just lost interest in history as a discipline, where I made a video about this, where if you compare almost anything you'd look for, you'd find that the importance of history in society has collapsed precipitously. And an easy example of this is look at pop culture references. If you look at the most popular movies in the 1940s, 50s, before that, the most popular books, even if you watch lighthearted comedies, you can tell from little details, like they'll make references to Edward the Confessor, or they'll talk about some obscure Wild West figure. And I was reading this book, Bulfinch's Mythology, and the book was written in the 19th century to be a guide so that nouveau riche Americans could catch up on the knowledge of the classics they need for society. And this is something you can read books written in the 19th century, and people say, it was a casual dinner party, and he mentioned Cadmus and Narcissus. And I'm thinking, that would never happen today. And so from all these details, you can piece together that this was a much more historically literate society. And I think what happened starting in the 60s is that we gained the idea that we became such a wealthy society that I think we lost a concept that we had to have external pressures to survive, or we had to hold ourselves to standards. And so there was this purposeful amnesia against history.
It's funny you say that, because I actually just saw Dune 2 recently. And you read the book Dune, and depends when you read it and how much context and history you have.
I read it.
But watching it in a very visual way, I was just kind of thinking as I was leaving, what percentage of the audience in the U.S. today understands how much of the kind of the motifs in that movie are just like overtly religious in the sense of both like Christianity and Islam, and the fact that like that just would fly over most people's heads because they're just not cultured in any amount of kind of like a Western civilization background, which any educated person or kind of any person who's literate in the late 19th century or early 20th century would have had that shared language, right? Even if you're not a kind of like a history nerd, like that was the assumption. Yeah. Whereas today's culture is everyone can tell you who Taylor Swift is dating, basically.
Yes, and it's like, Travis Kelce. But with Frank Herbert, he was actually a historian. I think he got the training to be a professional historian, and if he didn't, he was something pretty close. And so I like that you brought up Dune, because I think a reason Dune is so popular, and if you want to look at Narnia, Dune, Conan the Barbarian, and Tolkien, they're all written by people who are nearly history professors. Tolkien was a professor of Anglo-Saxon history. Same with Warhammer. The guys who made Warhammer
Foundation Asimov. He starts with, exactly. I was reading Gibbon's Fall of the Roman Empire, and I thought I should make a space opera.
Yeah, and so these people were pulling from history. And with Frank Herbert, it's almost as if he read some ancient author on the cycles of history, because you look at Dune, it has all these contiguous factors over human history. Because when we stare into the future, our fantasy of what we want the world to be is often what we believe the future to be more than the historic record. If you look across the historic record, there's always corruption, there's always autocracy, there's always scarcity, there's always religion. And no matter how wealthy, the world's economy has gone up probably 30 times over since in the last century. We still have all those things. And with Dune, you can tell that it's a future which looks a lot like the history, which makes it feel real and deep. And like, I'm going to throw some shade in a way it doesn't feel like that for Star Trek.
Absolutely. I mean, it is the universal components of humanity. And the brilliance of Dune from a sci-fi standpoint is he removes the technology in the sense that he just leaves it about the humanity, right? Yeah, there are some technological elements. Yeah, and effectively it is about economics. It's scarcity and religion, which are the two primary drivers of kind of major historical forces, right?
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. If you're a startup founder or executive running a growing business, you know that as you scale, your systems break down and the cracks start to show. If this resonates with you, there are 3 numbers you need to know: 36,000, 25, and 1. 36,000.
That's the number of businesses which have upgraded to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, streamline accounting, financial management, inventory, HR, and more. 25. NetSuite turns 25 this year. That's 25 years of helping businesses do more with less, close their books in days, not weeks, and drive down costs. 1, because your business is one of a kind, so you get a customized solution for all your KPIs in one efficient system with one source of truth. Manage risk, get reliable forecasts, and improve margins. Everything you need all in one place. Right now, download NetSuite's popular KPI checklist, designed to give you consistently excellent performance, absolutely free, at netsuite.com/turpentine. That's netsuite.com/turpentine to get your own KPI checklist. netsuite.com/turpentine.
Rudyard, why don't we go through maybe a couple of your big predictions that you talk about in some of the videos on your channel? For inspiration could be your belief that we might be headed towards another civil war, but I'll let you pick which of the predictions you think might be most interesting for our audience, or most non-obvious in some ways.
So for people who are getting into my content, I want you all to know that it's like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, in that I have hundreds of hours of predictions on the future. And so I might say some crazy things, but keep in mind there's a lot of backstory here. It's going to take me some time to pull you into the cult. And one of them is that I believe America, and I've made like 6 videos on this, I think America will have a civil war or a revolution in the next year. I said actually that I think it'll happen by the 2024 election. I say these things so that you know I'm not a charlatan. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And so that's prediction 1. We can go through these. Prediction 2 is, I think we're in the process of experiencing mouse utopia, which was an experiment in the 60s where you dropped a bunch of mice in perfect conditions, and then they kept breeding, and then the mouse social structure completely broke down. They stopped having kids. The mouse colony failed. That's prediction 2. Prediction 3, and this is something I've become a meme over, is I think Turkey will found a powerful empire, where I think Turkey is the future power of the Middle East. And prediction 4 is I think China is on the verge of revolution.
So let me kind of react. So I think China, verge of revolution or less stable than it is probably something I agree with, and we can discuss. Turkey actually as a power in the Middle East, also kind of agree with. That's a little bit Zihan, although I would say it is quite helpful to have the funding that the Saudis get from this like magical money source that comes from the ground.
Like Dune.
The revolution in the United States, or the civil war in the United States, actually would be an interesting one to talk about, because the Mouse-topia, actually, I think I agree with, in the sense that, declining birth rates. I mean, Elon makes a big play of this on Twitter. It's this kind of like slow-moving car crash that everyone knows is happening.
Yeah.
Yet you can't create an 18-year-old without 18 years. So that's its own problem. But maybe let's start with the first one.
It's good to know that we're mostly in agreement then.
I don't know if I agree on the revolution point, but let me see if I can kind of maybe make a point. I haven't seen your video. So are you kind of a big fan of this like 80-year cycle, like, fork turning type
one
thing?
Of them. I have like 5 or 6 models that come together at once. I mean that in one term of phrasing, not in the other term.
Okay.
I have like 5
So let's hear your argument for the revolution, whether it's 2024 or 2025, but why it's imminent in the near future.
This is like 2/3 of the podcasts I go on, but that means people like the content. So one of which is that we have a computer model that predicts revolutions, and this has worked over 20 times in history, and it predicts it based off 3 different factors. That being income inequality, average wages, and people competing for good jobs. Based off these 3 factors, you can predict over 20 revolutions over history to the years they take place in. And Peter Turchin developed these computer models, and so they predict the Russian Civil War, the French Revolution, the Roman Civil Wars, the Black Death, the fall of the 1600s War of Religion, the fall of Rome, etc. And this is a theory where it goes back decades, and it originally stems from a theory David Hackett Fisher made that you can use inflation rates to predict revolutions. And this is one of the theories I use of many, but the way this works is that if too much money is in the hands of a small amount of people, and everyone's competing for not a shrinking amount of good jobs, it removes incentives for cooperation. As the population gets more desperate, it means the population has to have a war to survive. And the last easy example of this in the Western world was the French Revolution. Other examples I spoke about before are like the 1600s, the Black Death. And this is a set pattern every 200 or so years. You could go back as far as we have records every 200 years, and this happens. And all the variables line up now, and they're just bleeping. And there's a bunch of factors you can use. For example, when the average age of marriage gets above 28, you're going to have a revolution. When height declines, that's a useful variable. Peter Turchin, the guy who does this, he established about 20 different variables that correlate together over history. And those variables are bleeping off right now. So that's one. The second one you mentioned is the generational cycle. And I haven't gotten that deep in that theory, but it's in the back of my head where there's a generational idea that every 80 years, the English-speaking world is a conflict. For example, the last one being World War II, American Civil War, American Revolution, Glorious Revolution, English Civil War, etc. So that's another one. And there's a third model, which is based off economic data, where I'm going to cut out a couple ones that are too weird to explain. But this third one is based off, this is one of the worst books I've read in my life too. It's based off economic data, where they look at spending in stuff like the military. And then from that, there's basically a major war every century in the Western world. So last one's the World Wars. Before that, the Napoleonic Wars. Before that, the War of Spanish Succession, 30 Years' War, etc. And so that's what I'm looking at. But also, besides that, something I'm looking at is that we are a population in which fighting-age men are massively dissatisfied, where you'll have this entire generation of young men where a third of men under 30 are virgins, mass economic issues where Gen Z men have 90% less spending capital than the baby boomers in their 20s. And we're at a point where over 90% of new job entries are not going to white people. And so you've built up this incentive structure where you have this large group of young, largely white men who don't have anything going on. And if you look at the elite, where the cultural elite, if we're going to be frank, the cultural elite is DEI people who are based in every major institution of society, whether the media, government bureaucracy, academia, the government, the military, the upper ranks of the military, the government bureaucracy, major corporations. You have this elite which doesn't like the idea of using physical force or having standards, and they think aggressive masculinity is toxic. So what you're looking at is a pressure equilibrium between a dissatisfied group of well-armed, aggressive young men who have nothing to lose and a ruling class which is scared of using physical force. How does this balance out?
Well, I mean, the challenge with that is in prior instances of this, the technological difference between the kind of military forces or the state or the people in power versus the average Joe, I think we're a little bit more normalized. And I think, yes, Americans have
actually different. That's
400 million weapons, 500 million weapons for 330 million people. But
if you look at the last 70 years, the military difference between irregular forces versus industrialized militaries has shrunk. So America lost the Vietnam War, France lost the Vietnam War, America and Russia both lost in Afghanistan. Hamas did better than we expected in Israel. The Ukrainians are beating the Russians, or at least they've kept the Russians from conquering them. And so we have a lengthy list of cases in which the underdog military force has punched above its weight against a more strong industrialized power. And the point I'd also make is that a majority of the U.S. military is right-leaning. The upper brass of the military is left-leaning, but if you look at the enlisted men, it's right-leaning. And I can't imagine if there's some kind of revolution that the enlisted men in the military and the officers, the in these sorts of revolutions, the people like the colonels and the sergeants are generally the ones that the enlisted men want to fight for because they're identifiable. And so in the French and the Russian revolutions, as an example, the military just sided with the rebels because they sympathized with them more.
But in the case of the right-leaning, enlisted man versus the kind of top brass being left-wing, if you have Trump get elected, right, and assuming they don't put him in prison, maybe that's the catalyst for all this, is that they put him in prison even though he's elected, and that's where you get something like a real insurrection, not fake stuff like January 6th. But the thing I would say is, isn't he the release valve? So you put Trump in office, and he kind of doesn't do anything because the establishment is its own board. But the reality is the disaffected young man got to vote for Trump, which is a big middle finger to the establishment, and on we go, right? I think, and we were talking about, I don't know, I'm assuming you're familiar with Curtis Yarvin, but, his kind of like big American Caesar push. But that to me seems more reasonable in the sense that, like, so when people say Civil War, it's, two armies lining up fighting. They're making this dumb movie about the Civil War, modern Civil War in the US that's coming out later this year. But I think of it as like a revolution could also just be a political revolution in the sense of like a true American Caesar who comes in and really, FDR style. So within the establishment, but radically changes everything. That to me feels like a more likely outcome of an American Revolution. But it's not like people are lining up and fighting battles in Tulsa.
What I would say is that expecting the world is not reasonable, and expecting the world to be reasonable is in fact unreasonable. Where if you look over human history, we resort to violence very quickly, and it's scary to watch. And so first of all, a disclosure I throw out is I can say these general trends. I don't know how they could play out. Maybe it won't start next year. Maybe it'll start in 5 years. I don't think that's true, but it could happen. I work off probabilities here. So I think there is a probability the left could win under certain circumstances. And this election is a massive toss card where this election will determine a lot. And so the future as of now will be determined by choices that are made in the next year. That being said, we're at a point where almost the entire establishment is left-wing and doesn't like Trump. So I can't imagine that if Trump was pushing them to change the system, that the establishment would go with him. And we're at the point now where the incentive structure for the Republican and the Democrat leaders is to start a civil war, because that's easier for them to stay in power. Where if you're a Republican leader, your voters will be so enraged when there are 4 years the Democrats, then why not just start a civil war to stay in office? If you're a Democrat leader, if Trump's winning, why not just start a civil war to stay in office? And my opinion is there are a handful of gauges that we can't push much further. The debt's one of them, where our debt is piling higher and higher and higher, and we're only barely passing new budgets every few months. But if you're constantly rolling those dice, it's going to turn over. And you look at the French Revolution, the English Civil War, most of these conflicts, the easiest thing to start it is a budget issue. Immigration is another, where if Biden wins, I think Red State America, there's a solid chance they'd launch a revolution to not have more immigration. And so there are all of these things where I think most people don't realize how desperate the average American is and how so many people in this country want there to be a war. And the thing is, most people can be normies who don't want this to happen. But if 3% of the population on each side wants there to be a war and they start it, that will force everyone else's hands to do the war. And I see these small factions of radicals already existing who would push for that.
Yeah, I find it hard to believe, let's take the Texas situation where, Abbott is writing this sternly worded letter and saying we're going to take it to the courts. But what is he going to mobilize, federal military troops that are stationed in Texas, or call back, Texans to come and protect the state of Texas? I just don't, it doesn't seem like that like logically plays out, at least in the modern system.
I've done this debate like 10 times. I've been on a lot of these podcasts, and I always hit this argument that it doesn't seem right because our brains, we assume that the future won't be like the past. But that's what every era thinks, and every era is wrong. So you can't have an extended period of peace. And you look at the American Civil War, people didn't think there'd be a war. World War I, people didn't think there'd be a war. World War II, people wouldn't think there'd be a war. People always think it's not going to happen this time, and it eventually does.
Yeah, but it part of it is also, I just don't think that there's the allegiance to the place in the same way. I mean, I think part of the modern way of living is you move people all around the country. And so, yeah, I'm a Texan, but I'm living in San Francisco working in tech, or I'm a Democrat who happens to live in Austin because I'm a history professor. I think the locality compared to something like the Civil War is significantly different. And I think that the willingness to die for a place doesn't feel like that is the national consciousness now. I think that basically the only thing left is people are willing to die for the country, and it's a very small percentage of people, right? Like, that fighting for the country in World War II was a much more universalizing force than it is today. And I think I tend to side with Curtis on this. Is that, like, basically you can't even get people to do any violence in the streets for the most part. And what they do is they just kind of sit on Twitter, and that's where it's like trigger fingers to Twitter fingers. I use this line from Drake all the time, but the reality is, like, the amount of kinetic energy that is available to protest things today compared to the 60s. I mean, I think I read something in I want to say it was in like Nixon Land or the follow-up book, where it was saying that something like there was like a bombing a day in the 70s. Like for like a 3 or 4 year period, the FBI was responding to like a mailbox bomb. And it was just the level of like kinetic energy that radical left-wing people had in the 70s relative to today. It was just significantly more. So I'm curious how you think about that, because I think it's almost like the smartphone has kind of like taken away the will of most people.
In a low T society, how do people have the energy for it? Like,
it depends.
Yeah.
It depends what sub-demographic you're in. I find people tend to assort into like-minded groups. So what you said about people moving around too much, that's probably true of the people in your network, but it's demographically a relatively small group of Americans, where this is actually the era of American history when people move the least across state borders in their lives. And also for the English Civil War, when at the start of the war, everyone said, we're way too pacified as a society. England hadn't had a major war, at least a land war, in over a century. And so at the start of the English Civil War, everyone said people are too lazy to fight this. And that's not what happened. And the thing is, you need a small group of insane people to mobilize. And because the normies don't mobilize,
right,
they don't really get a say. And then the insane people conscript the normies. So in the English Civil War, they just randomly conscript guys off the barroom floor or from towns. And then the radicals would get the normies to fight. And I do see these people all the time because I'm stuck on right-wing Twitter, and I just see it all the time. And I see it in both the right and the left, because I'll glimpse at left-wing Twitter. Maybe a majority of left-wing influencers have said that you need to use violence to fight the right. Vaush, a leftist influencer who hates me, he said leftists need to start buying guns to fight against the right. Jackson Hinkle said something similar. And on right-wing Twitter, there's this parallel of people. I say bloodlust is bad. I say killing. I literally make tweets where I say needlessly killing people is bad. And people are like, you're a loser. And I'm thinking, yeah.
And is that criticism from the right or from the left or both?
Oh, from the right, yeah.
So, okay. But these are people who are not doing any killing. It's not like they've kind of like been in the military and these heroic Spartans. Like, this is just, it's the classic South Park meme of the guy who's like sitting there at his computer, playing World of Warcraft. Like I just don't think that the organizational energy exists. Where it's like, where is the radical change that is happening in any level of society by anybody? It's just like slow moving idiocracy from like a woke DEI Borg of federal government. It's like there is no like radical revolution in any state whatsoever.
Well, that's my question for Reddit is, who are the people who are going to be fighting? Is it these people on I totally agree that people on Twitter will continue to hate each other and just like digitally fight every day. And at some point, like, you know, there'll be like civilian access to like weapons or something where they actually don't have to like fight in the streets or something. They could just like fight from their computer. And maybe that will be, you know, what we're talking about here. But the people who are actually doing the fighting, Rudyard, is that the people on Twitter, or is that sort of like poor white people who are not on Twitter and poor black people who are not on, like, who are the people who are going to be doing the fighting?
When you look at these crises, what occurs is that there's a flashpoint that people can't deal with. World War I, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand dying. American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln getting elected. English Civil War, not being able to pass a budget. French Revolution, not being able to pass a budget. And so this tiny issue at an impractical moment demands one side give something, the other side take. And they just say, we're not going to do that. We hate you too much. And so the civil wars often start for intractable small reasons. And then it just spirals out. And so people's mindsets change very rapidly in a civil war. So this happens, people become tribalistic. And for every major war the English-speaking world has done, for the first 6 months, they were unprepared. That happened for the American Civil War. It happened for the English Civil War. It happened for World War I, World War II, the American Revolution. In every major English-speaking war, we weren't ready when it started, and then we had to spend the first 6 months preparing. And so I see an entire generation of young men who don't really have much going on, and they'd be the ones fighting. It's guys who can't get a good job, they're not in a relationship,
who are they fighting?
Yeah, like what are they doing? So you're in Ohio, you're one of these people. Are you hopping in a car and driving to DC? Like what is the what are you taking over?
It would be a series of triggers in which it's not the world we see today. The series of triggers are something like step one, the Republicans and Democrats can't pass a budget. Then Texas says we back the Republicans. California says we back the Democrats. There's a split between states on which states support the other faction's budget. Texas National Guards, or let's say Ohio National Guards, then start skirmishing with New York National Guards. You have this skirmish. One officer escalates, he invades New York. There's a political crisis at this point, and then someone else escalates. And now at this point, we know that the states are split up. They can't really do anything. So over the next 6 months, the Republicans and Democrats both conscript young men inside their army. And so in the same manner do you remember what our worldview was like before COVID?
Yeah.
We're like 5 steps more insane 4 years later. Imagine adding another, let's say, 4 years on top of that. The processes of us getting more insane since COVID just make that exponential.
Right. Or it's a whiskey rebellion and the federal government comes in and crushes it because they have, F-15s and they cruise missiles, and that's the end of the rebellion in Ohio. Like
what I'd say though is look at Texas, where 25 states supported Texas, and 10 states supported Texas militarily. So Texas did this, and then 10 states said we will send troops to Texas to fight for Texas. And this all
why didn't that escalate anymore? Like because, what organizational capacity do they actually have outside of doing effectively the tweet, which is what the letter is?
Oh, they have a tremendous amount. The American National Guards are one of the most advanced militaries in the world. You'd probably put Texas's National Guard in the top 5 or 6 militaries in the world. And so
but they don't have any air assets. They don't have cruise missiles.
I feel like we're being like DCs.
Look at the Vietnam War. Look at Afghanistan. You don't need that to win a war. And Afghanistan's Appalachia is twice the size of Afghanistan. And that also assumes the military will follow the centralized government. which I don't think it would all do. I think it would split or lean heavily right.
Let's play this out. So you have like, okay, so Texas is now what, independent? They don't want to pay.
They form a separatist government in Austin. This separatist government claims to be the main government. The 25 states which support Texas, no one secedes. They just have the one true government.
But that's just federalism, and like, as long as the federal government gets their taxes, are you saying that they're not going to pay the taxes anymore?
No, they say, we are the one true government. Washington, D.C. are evildoers who are destroying the truth of American democracy. Thus, the provisional government is in Austin now. Then 25 states support this provisional government.
And what are the congressmen from Texas and what do the senators from Texas say? Do they go home and they recognize that, or do they realize that like their power lies in?
I think a couple normies are going to cope about this, and then as time passes, the normies will lose the ability to cope. I mean,
yeah, I just
COVID happened so rapidly, and you could be in retrospect, oh my God, the states wouldn't support the government's decision on COVID. When COVID happened, it happened in a week. We all fell into lockstep.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm trying to say is like, so COVID's a great example. Is like the states just decided to do their own thing, but the reality is they all suckle at the teat of the federal government. They need that funding, so they cannot operate without the federal funding structure. That is part of the FDR plan. But everyone is dependent on the federal system, like in terms of the federal budget, the federal revenue collection. These red states need California taxes.
Dan, let's steelman the other side for a second. It does seem plausible that Red America and Blue America will continue to cleave, like continue to become kind of their own tribe that have less and less in common with each other as they continue to marry each other and have kids and kind of create this parallel economy. And so 10 years from now, 20 years from now, does it seem to make sense that they might want to sort of not have anything to do with the other? Or like,
but the reality is everyone's rich in the United States. Even like, like the
most
people who are poor.
A majority of Americans. So this is based off perceived income rather than actual income, where a majority of Americans don't have $1,000 for an emergency bill. Most Americans are on the edge of barely survive. They're on the edge of bankruptcy. And it doesn't matter if they're richer than Egypt because they're not comparing themselves to Egyptians.
But the average American is always thinking that they're just one good break away from making it big. And that is fundamentally an American belief, right? So I think that's always kind of been the case. And so I think that, you can look at data and this or that, but the reality is I think like, I don't know. I know plenty of average Americans, like, and I don't think that life is that bad for them. Like, could it be better? Sure. But I think most people want to keep their head down and not, and I don't think that the radical people have that much organizational capacity, nor do they have that much sway.
We have a bunch of statistics on this. Between Gen Z today has 90% less spending capital than the baby boomers did in their 20s. The cost of housing has gone up 80% since COVID. The cost of basic necessities has gone up 50%. The cost of education has gone up 400% over the last couple of decades. And you look at, I look at that stuff. The thing I look at the most is wellness statistics. And I think that's the best proxy. If you look at how much sleep people are having, what their weight is, how often they get married, how many kids they have, I think that's a proxy for their mental state. And what happens when a large part of the population, because most Americans, the age of marriage is getting higher, the kids they have is less, is that on an evolutionary basis, if people can't procreate, they're going to start a war because we were designed to procreate. And the political opinions of the normies generally don't matter in civil wars. And you look at these conflicts, what often happens is a tiny minority of insane people win. The Bolsheviks were 3% of Russia's population before the Russian Revolution. The Jacobins were also 3% or less of France's population. The insane Puritans were 10% of England's population before they seized control of England in a dictatorship. So what happens is that, let's say, the 50% of normal people, no one's like, let's build a normal person identity. Let's have riots for normal people. And so they kind of get shoved along by these crazy people. And so when you have two groups of crazy people, all of these normal people in between, they're like, I have to back my crazy people so that their crazy people don't seize power.
But in all of those cases, and Martin Malia's book on this, I think, is the best treatment, is it's all elites versus elites that start the conflict. And then the normies and crazy people are used as tools by those elites. I don't see, there's no fracture from the elites, even though they play it on TV.
Go out to Texas, go out to Ohio.
But the rich people aren't in conflict in the United
States. What
States.
about Elon? Imagine if Elon became president.
You know, as long as the McKinsey people are making money and like in the Goldman people are making money and the kind of like, you know, basically rich coastal elites, as long as they continue to make money, whether they're Republican or Democrat, most of them are Democrat.
You saw if Trump was as competent as Elon with everything that they threw at Trump, could you not? I mean, like they were making money during the Trump era, but people went ballistic, right? Like people went legit insane. Like people, like.
But the economy still keeps working, and so that's the thing is what incentive do the elites have to break the system? So there is no historical basis of the masses revolting against the elites. It doesn't work. It's the elites when they fracture. One group grabs the convenient group and then overthrows the existing system.
People don't believe this, but red state and blue state America have the exact same economic size. So the coasts don't completely dominate the American economy because Florida, Texas, even states like Pennsylvania, where I grew up, those are economically significant states. And there is a sizable anti-left elite, which is how the Republican Party gets funding. You go to the states I described, like you go to Dallas. Dallas has a massive economy, and it's almost all conservative. Similar with Miami. Philadelphia's elite, I think, leans right. And these are not unimportant places.
But they send their kids to Harvard and Dartmouth and all of these woke institutions.
They send them to University of Texas or University of...
I think that they're all of the rich people for the most part. Like, yes, there are some exceptions. They're all in one big blob. And they have certain political opinions one way or the other, but they all go to the same dinner parties. They all belong to the same clubs, right?
We're talking
they go to the same
most rich. There's in the models I've looked for this, it's the top 10% who are the elite. And what I would say is that look at the French Revolution. The aristocracy who got killed in the French Revolution were the top 2% of the population, and it was being egged on by the merchant classes who were also wealthy, but they weren't part of the same elite. And also, you want to look at elites. The military, there are lots of people in the military who would tilt right, like colonels, sergeants, even admirals and generals who haven't been replaced. So there is a conservative elite who has an incentive to defect. And what I'd also say is that if you're a young white man, what incentive do you have to not defect? If you're a young white male elite aspirant, because the vast majority of new hires are not white men.
But young elite white men still get jobs. Like obviously they do.
Depends what range of the elite. You're talking the 1%. I'm talking the 10%.
Yeah, I guess I just go back to is like who controls all the levers of power. It's a very small group. I don't think it's in the top 10%. I think it's closer to the top 1%. And I think as long as those groups are in control, even if they're right or left and they're all benefiting from the system, I don't think the system gets rocked.
You could have said that about France before their revolution. You could have said that at Russia before their revolution.
But France is fundamentally a fight between the king and his derelict spending habits and a dying feudal system. So it's still fundamentally an elite problem, right?
So,
they still killed off the elite.
Right, but that is in the throes of a revolution after you already have a split. It's the same thing with the English Civil War.
If the elite's divided, how come the Republicans and the Democrats are fighting each other over the budget so tightly? That's two elite coalitions fighting each other. And
I think that's just made for TV drama. Like it's like Marjorie Taylor Greene showing up
at an actual political issue. And if you
why does it always get funded?
Because the incentive is not to defect yet. but they're constantly, like, you'd be insane to think the right and the left is a made-up struggle in American politics. And if for the society you're describing, that's Canada. Canada is a country where there's a single coherent elite, and nothing like Trump has been seen in Canada. So you can compare Canada and America, where Canada is what you're describing, but in America, the right and the left are constantly butting heads.
Yeah, but I think Congress is a different thing than a national popularity contest, which is what the president is. And that's why Trump manifests in the way Trump does at the national level. But we, despite the kind of, people who are obstructionists on the right side in Congress, it's still, for the most part, Kevin McCarthy is the Republican bulk in terms of, their establishment. It's Mitch McConnell, right? Like, yes, they got some judges in there, but the reality is they're all swamp creatures.
I think you've been projecting the social structure inside technology across the rest of the population. A unified, very small leftist elite based on the coasts, a population of transients. Politics doesn't really matter. It's an alliance needing different power. This is a description of the social structure of technology, not of the general public.
Well, it's the social structure of the elite, and that's what
There are multiple elites. Texas oil guys are an elite. You have a bunch of different sub-economies in America that people don't think about that are still incredibly important.
I don't doubt their importance. I just think that in terms of how much influence they have over the actual American political establishment.
The problem with all these revolutions is that the elite overestimated their power vis-a-vis the public. That's what the Russian elite would say before their revolution. That's what the French elite would say before their revolution. They would say the small elite has total power. Thus, we don't have to worry, but they miscalculated.
Yeah. Anyways, let's... I know we only have so much time. I'm curious if we want to talk about one of your other predictions.
Sure. How long do you want this to go for?
Maybe let's do, Dan, you got like 15 more minutes, or?
Yeah, that works good for me.
You guys should keep going if you want to keep going.
And I'll just say it's always easier. I really appreciate the prediction. It's always easier to it's kind of like startups, to say why a thing won't happen than to go out on a limb and say why it could happen.
Well,
so
let me put mine out there. I think I agree with it. The 80-year cycle thing is like a rough guide of like there's going to be some amount of change, and I suspect that within the next few elections, I'm more bullish on the American system is going to continue to work. Partially because I just don't think any other country is thriving. If there was like actually an ascendant star, I would actually say maybe this is the end of the empire. I think I'm much more in the camp of, we are going to end up with some version of an American Caesar, and it's FDR, so it might not be as dramatic as crossing the Rubicon, but I do think a fundamental shift of the American system by a Trump-like populist who is competent. That is actually, and it could be on the left, which would be very scary to me because I think like an AOC or someone like that could pull that out. And that actually, if you get a left populist, then I would actually believe you that you might have a little bit more of a fracture. But my sense is it's probably going to be a right-wing populist, just given where the establishment is, the power structure. And I think that right-wing populist is going to be as populist as Trump, but way slicker in terms of the kind of feel.
I agree with
that. He's going to be able to actually totally overhaul the system.
What?
So some people will think that is Caesarism, right? Like the end of the Republic, and other people are going to be like, maybe in the Curtis camp of like, wow, this is pretty great. We have public safety. Like we don't have some of these asinine policies. We've cut the size of this huge federal bureaucracy. So maybe that's a little optimistic, but that's what I think will probably happen.
So Vivek Ramaswamy.
No, absolutely not.
I was going to say a little Xanax.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody, how do you react to that? Does that sound true to you?
Yeah, I think that's generally right. What I'd say is that Trump proved something where Trump is like a hurricane who just smashed in, he did his thing, but Trump is not. Trump has certain shortcomings, which the person who comes after Trump, who fills his shoes, could fill those. Where someone could be more, again, as you said, more slick than Trump, more polished, more cunning. That person can show up and just do really, really well, because there's that void that is established by Trump and has been demonstrated to exist. That being said, I think once you have the trial run of Trump, you could look back and think these are the things I would change.
Yeah, and I mean, look, you have if you actually want to really beat this analogy with dead horse type thing, you have the Pompey before Caesar, right? So you
Yes.
already have the change in the Roman system before you actually have the one who shows up, who then is killed, and then you have the unifying one, the one that creates the actual peace. And so my view is we probably are going to see evolutionary versions of Trump beyond this next 4-year period that are going to, just like COVID, are going to get even more and more infectious within the population, because they're going to hit that seam in the same way, but they're actually going to have a level of competence potentially when they're in office, because so much of it's one thing to get elected. And I think the Bannon interview, which I don't know if you've seen this, Rudyard, there's like, I want to say it's like 4 hours of cutting or uncut interview of Steve Bannon with Frontline. So not necessarily the most favorable audio, interviewer, but he just goes through the whole thing. And the most interesting moment of this interview is when he talks about they didn't think they'd win the election. They win the election, and the immediate descent of the entire Republican establishment to just kind of remove this change engine. And his frustration of saying this could have been, it's like Bannon, Steve Miller, like not the people that most people are excited about, but the idea is that there was a cohort of people that were early to Trump when he was the contrarian bet. Peter Thiel, biology potentially being the FDA chair, like all of these things that could have happened in an alternate version of the Trump administration. Instead, he kind of the deal maker, the people pleaser that he is, thought he was going to be able to integrate himself into the system, and obviously the system, across the board basically rejected him. So I think revenge Trump might actually be different. So I'm curious, but I just don't think he has the competence from a managerial standpoint, and the trust in people. Like, you could argue that Kushner is a competent person, and he's, as close to being trusted as anyone. But even then, it's like everyone knows it's kind of Trump is shooting from the hip. But the ability to radically overhaul the federal bureaucracy and fight that kind of entrenched set of interests, I think requires a Caesar, or more importantly, an Augustus-like personality who deeply understands the system and his ability to manage it, right?
This reminds me of the Amaury Riencourt book I spoke before, The Coming Caesars, where right in the 50s, he said that America would descend into Caesarism with a similar process to Rome. And I think the closest figure to Trump is the Gracchi brothers, who in Rome right after Rome had become a great power, and this is right when Rome descended into the civil wars and Caesarism, Rome experienced a lot of very similar social issues to us today. It was an intensely unequal society. It was very politically divided between two separate parties. Rome was a reluctant superpower. And there was mass corporations that killed the Roman middle class, as well as immigration and globalization, which killed the Roman middle class. And the Gracchi brothers ran off the ideal, let's basically make Rome great again. Let's rebuild the Roman middle class. And then they went off this platform. They were very popular. They got elected. And then the leading Roman establishment tried to remove them for saying they were trying to make themselves dictator, and then assassinated the Gracchi brothers. And then the assassination of the Gracchi brothers resulted in the fall of the Roman Republic, which took like 70, 80 years, which we spoke of before, like Pompey and Crassus and Caesar and Augustus. And that's why I've said it would not surprise me if Trump gets assassinated.
Yeah, I mean, or gets put in jail, which is effectively, in at least the modern political sense, a ticky-tack case in Georgia, taking the duly elected president of the United States, and now we have some weird thing where he's president, but he's sitting in a Georgia jail. I mean, it's just like you're asking for just chaos, right? And so, look, I basically my view is very much, I just don't think the average American is it has the kinetic energy that they did 50 years ago. Blame it low T is what Erik said. But I do think we are in for a, call it 10 to 20 year period of political turbulence that on the other side of that, I think there's a fundamental change in terms of like how American society, especially at the federal level, works. So I'm very much in that camp. Obviously, if I knew exactly how it'd play out, I would be
maybe let's segue and close on sort of the China topic, because it's the biggest counterforce to the U.S. Obviously, Rudyard, are you in the Zihan camp that sort of implosion is basically inevitable, and you don't think they can sort of innovate their way out of it, whether it's AI or other sort of technologies that they may be advanced in or could advance in that could help replace some of the human labor?
Zihan's been a big influence on me. And I do believe he's right where I think China's going to have a revolution. And I think China has far more serious social issues than America does, in that Chinese youth unemployment's at 50% now. And they have weird rules where you can't leave your hometown. So I think for all of us, we're transients. We don't live where we grew up. That's technically illegal in China. In China, they have mass aging, where their birth rate is now a quarter of what it would have to be stable. Their housing market's absolutely insane. A quarter of the entire Chinese economy is in the housing market. So I think you're basically setting up a series of variables where the average Chinese person doesn't have an incentive to cooperate, and they're going to have a revolution where there's a large bracket. The largest young bracket of Chinese are people who are in their late 30s. So they're not going to have children. They don't have the money to retire. They're aging out of the Chinese labor market that's very young-centered. So I think that this will result in social panic. And just, even if it doesn't happen now, how do you survive with a country that is 4 times as many people in their 80s as their 20s? That's just not going to work.
Yeah, I mean, I think their demographic bomb is unsolvable. I think biology is probably the most credible answer to it, in that he would say that they would do this through automation, and that Japan kind of dealt with something similar. I think, to your point, they have way bigger issues because they're a much poorer country than Japan was in terms of at that point. And I think you can see it in how the CCP under Xi is just taking away bit, but you kind of hit this peak, and I think of it as actually manifested through a lot of this Chinese tech, and then the kind of Xi flip, where now it's like you're taking basically who should be celebrated, these kind of global heroes, like people knew who Jack Ma was, right? And you're disappearing them, you're kind of pulling things back in, and I think it's hard to just be an observer from the United States, not in China. I don't speak Chinese. I don't actually know anyone meaningfully who lives in China. But I think just observing the kind of public change at the CCP level, to me, feels like it is a move towards more control. And a move towards more control is usually in a society that they either believe that it's going to be less stable, so therefore they need to put in more control now, because that's the only way to kind of keep the system running.
I agree with that. I think it's important. The number one thing to look at is someone's actions. And the Chinese government, through their actions, dictates that they're desperate.
Yeah, I mean, like everything, right? Like they haven't opened anything up to make it easier. They've only made it harder.
And so what could the revolution look like, or what would China look like on the other side of that? Is there a world in which there's still a major global threat, or does it implode basically?
My best guess is that in the coming American election crisis, China attacks Taiwan. This invasion fails, and then through that, it precipitates the collapse of the mandate of heaven, which lets the populace rebel. Because in Chinese culture, there's this ideal that heaven, or God, establishes the emperor's right to rule under certain conditions. And then if they failed an invasion of Taiwan, that would demonstrate that conditions have been broken and the Chinese can morally and legally remove the government.
Yeah, and whether or not they're able to invade Taiwan, I think my read of that is just look what happened with Russia and Ukraine. And I think the difference is Russia has oil that it can sell, even if it's kind of janky in terms of how they're doing it and at the discount. China's doesn't have a commodity. Like the whole Chinese economy works off the fact that Walmart and all of these other kind of Western big corporates manufacture stuff in China.
Yes.
And so those corporates are not going to be smuggling T-shirts out of China or whatever product that they're doing. And in that world, that loss of ability to play in the kind of WTO approved China like economy that they've had for the last 20 years, that would be this most significant fallout.
That's a great point. I hadn't thought of it, but you're definitely right.
Right. Yeah. So fundamentally is just even and I mean, Zihan would say this, but like, I think just even you lop off 25% of Chinese exports because you have some number of countries that are now in compliance. I think the whole system falls apart. And so, I think the China bulls would say, okay, China's domestic consumption could be its own thing, but the reality is, just look at it, it's an export dependent economy. And this is, I think, I've had a very like up and down relationship with Zihan in terms of, I think I have some Gelman amnesia in terms of like, as soon as you started talking about Tesla and crypto and things that I know a lot about, and he's just off the reservation, I'm like, okay, is this guy completely right? But I think one interesting point, and you can just look at the primary sources, is the U.S. is the least export-dependent economy in any of the major like economic countries. Like we literally just don't export stuff that is meaningful outside of services and things that are at like the highest part of the food chain. And we're energy independent, right? And so I think the strongest parts of Zihan are actually rooted in just like the simplest observations, demographics, like energy, like what are you actually dependent on to make your country work? And I think that to me feels like the most fragile thing for China is like it is heavily reliant on energy imports, despite them building 400 nuclear reactor plants or whatever. Like it's just like they still need fossil fuels. And they are dependent on exports. And so any version of them attacking Taiwan, and by the way, I think this is like a decent chance that they attack Taiwan if you just fundamentally believe that Xi is now an actual dictator and seems a little kind of batty in terms of like he's just making decisions and hard to know how much of that is actually true, but if you just put it as like okay, he's the next Stalin or Mao or pick your whatever, and we have the historical records there, is that, absolute power like that really can make you make a lot of weird decisions. And especially if you're surrounded by sycophants that are going to just tell you what you want to hear. But I think just like a very simple, like import export, China needs the world economy. And if they get cut off by the world economy as a result of the West just saying you're not getting to participate, I think it's going to be, because those are where the markets are, right? Like, I don't think China can turn around and do one belt, one road and sell all of the exports that they were previously selling to the West to Africa. I'm sorry. Like, the only thing you can sell to Africa is like cheap money and railroads. And the reality is they're not consumer markets, right?
Yeah. I think your point's generally true, where if you look at thinkers, the simplest assumptions they make tend to be the best. And the more they extrapolate out, the sillier it is. So, for example, a lot of people won't believe this because we're politically different. Karl Marx has had a giant intellectual influence on me. And you could say Karl Marx is one of the thinkers which has influenced my thought the most, even though I'm the opposite side of the political spectrum, because Karl Marx invented class analysis. And class analysis is something I do all the time. Sigmund Freud, too. People hate Sigmund Freud. He invented the concept of the subconscious, which we use all the time. And so for a lot of these thinkers, they have these baseline concepts that are brilliant that we use all the time, but they've become such baselines that we don't reflect on how brilliant their initial creation was.
This is my thing with the book Sapiens, which I think gets this terrible rap.
I like the book, actually, which will surprise
I think it's great. And I think the concept of a myth, which like we have another term for that, meme, like I live it every single day. And like the idea that, I work in cryptocurrency. Like, why is Bitcoin valuable? Because other people believe that it has value, right? And so, like, it's fascinating to me that it's just like an educated person just doesn't actually understand that as a fundamental human concept, because they think everything should have intrinsic value, and it actually it creates this thing where I think an otherwise intelligent person, when they just like cannot accept that humans are mimetic like that, I now start to question. I'm like, what other things do you actually just like don't fundamentally understand about the world?
I can explain this. Ken Wilber has a theory of levels of consciousness, and people can't literally see beyond their level of consciousness. So, someone at level 6, they think everything's independent. Most of our society, especially California, is at level 6. People at level 6, they can't think in statistical probabilities because they think everyone's special. They can't say someone of certain demographic does something more on a statistical basis. It's like, I could meet someone of that group who's not like that. People at level 2, they're incapable of thinking past their basic group. And so if you go to a group in the Amazon and you tell them, hey, if you do this, someone in a different continent will die. They'll think, not my problem. They're not part of my tribe. And people at level 4, that's the level like a lot of social conservatives are at, where it's, I will follow my religion and my social code, and anything beyond that is unimportant to me. So people are stuck at different levels of consciousness, and they just can't neurologically understand what goes beyond that level of consciousness.
It reminds me of I'm going to get this wrong. It's something like a double conditional or something, and it actually related to IQ, and it's something basically. Say that again.
I know what you're talking about. It's the idea, imagine I didn't have breakfast and I was in a foreign country. I think a majority of the population is incapable of comprehending that, or it's some staggering number. Might not be a majority, but it's some really scary number.
Well, this is the point of that is like you or I, or, I think a lot of people listening to this podcast, like can take that double hypothetical and like construct the situation. And there's a good number of people in the world, a lot of people in the world that stop after the first one. Yeah. And they just like they can't process them simultaneously in a completely abstract sense.
Yes. The theory I've developed is that people have cameras. So a camera is how many perspectives you can see at once. Someone at one camera is, I can only see how I see this. 2 cameras is, I can see this, and also how my ideology sees it. Camera 3 is you can compare 2 views at once. And so the amount of people who can see multiple cameras gets exponentially smaller, where you get to a genius who's at 6 cameras, where, let's say Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu was a strategic genius. He could see at 6 cameras, thus he wrote The Art of War, because he could do all these different analyses. And so when I look at people, I think, how many cameras do they have on this at once?
That's a great frame.
Thanks.
I have to run. This was an enjoyable conversation. Sorry I gave you a hard time on the part. I mean, part of
this is my job.
The enjoyment of the podcast is hearing both of the sides of the perspective.
Yeah, it's my job to get my balls busted when I need to.
This is a great discussion. Roger, thanks so much for coming to the podcast. And
thank you so much for having me.
Everyone check out What If All This and History 102. All right, thanks, Dan. Thanks, Roger.